let's go into my story. Hello my beautiful friends, welcome back to our channel. Today is going to be all about my story and I really want you to keep that in mind as you listen. If this is something that you're going through at the moment, you might have a wildly different experience or thoughts about what's happening, and that is okay. It's your experience and they're your thoughts. You're always free to think how you want to think and totally own your own experience. I and nobody else can take that away from you, no matter how convincing, compelling, passionate or certain we seem to be. You know you and you know you right now. For me, how I hope to serve from this video is anything from empowering you, giving you some power back through a new perspective if you're going through the same thing, to simply being a comfort for you, reminding you that you're a human and this is a shared human experience, something that so many people go through from so many different walks of life. With that being said, let's jump into it. We're talking about my story today with my severe clinical depression. And this is a part of the Perfectionism Programming series because it's important to me to give you the opportunity to think about how your perfectionism programming isn't always harmless. There can be high costs to pay. For me, again, my personal experience, this way of thinking directly contributed to my sense of worthlessness and the belief that I am simply a burden on the world. What I am not saying, sharing this story with you, is that this, my story, is the case for everyone with clinical depression, or that it's the case for everybody with a perfectionism mindset. That would be an oversimplification of the problem. In the medical community, depression remains a syndrome to us that's not fully understood in terms of pathology and etiology, meaning the causes and the mechanisms for perpetuating the disease. Clinical depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions are simply not completely understood yet. Perfectionism or perfectionism programming in itself is not a mental illness. It's not a medical problem. People with a perfectionism mindset might be suffering, but they're not suffering significant dysfunction. They're still highly functioning. Distinct from clinical depression, which is a mental illness, a medical problem. It necessitates the input from a mental illness professional. This means a doctor at a baseline needs to be involved in or overseeing your care, a general practitioner or a psychiatrist. Because perfectionism, the perfectionism mindset, is made up and held up by cognitive distortions and thought errors. Thought management, the skill of thought management, is how we deal with this mindset programming perspective of seeing the world. How we can approach and correct, improve, upgrade this current set of neural pathways that are so efficient for your brain. They have become your brain's default. They are your programming, how you tend to respond to the world, especially when you're not thinking consciously or deliberately. Thought management, like we do in coaching for perfectionism, is not an all-encompassing treatment for depression. With clinical depression, there is almost never a single treatment approach that resolves the problem. Thought management, the skill of thought management, is a well-established treatment for clinical depression as well. And in medicine, we call this CBT, Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. This was developed by psychiatrists about 50 years ago, Dr. Aaron Beck, when Dr. Beck recognized that in his patients, a lot of his behaviors stemmed from distorted thinking. Other mental illness or mental health professionals include psychologists, therapists, counselors, social workers, and also in some places, the specialist mental health nurses or specialist mental health nurse practitioners. If you have any doubt as to whether your perfectionism is simply that, or whether you are suffering from clinical depression or anxiety or any other mental illness, see your doctor. I want you sitting in front of your doctor and asking them the question. When you're in a mental illness, your thinking is distorted, and that's on top of our already difficult ability to judge ourselves. So that is the test. Any doubt, any question resemblance any question resemblance to clinical depression or another mental illness, see a professional. Let them look at your brain with you. It is very difficult to see problem thinking from your brain that's doing the problem thinking. Do you see what I mean? All right, lots of seriousness, but it is warranted. There is too much unnecessary suffering in the world today. Now, on a not at all brighter note, welcome to my story. When I was about 15, in grade 9, I deteriorated into a severe clinical depression. And I don't think it was a rapid avalanche. I think I didn't recognize, and the people around me didn't recognize, that it was happening long before that. That I was already in a mild, moderate clinical depression leading up to that. I had no idea. Even when it was severe, that was the first point in which it got noticed by somebody else, not by me actually. I remember my home group teacher, Miss Hardback. She's now married and no longer Miss Hardback. And things were great. I was lucky that I fit this mold of what our school system seemingly wants us to do, of what it tells you implicitly and explicitly is begetting for inevitable success and therefore a happy, fulfilling life. This was specifically, I was excellent in academics and in sport. And as you well know, our schools recognize, celebrate, and reward successes in those areas especially. You know, it's certainly acknowledged more and held in a falsely higher regard in things like art, music, other areas that are in our curriculum. So school was great. I did a lot of sport out of school and lots of extracurricular activities. Home was great. My parents had split up, but nothing ever made me doubt that I wasn't wholly supported and loved. I had great friends. I felt like I fit in well at school. And I'd even just won my first overseas trip to Europe from an essay competition. Something that was absolutely superfluous, something that wasn't otherwise possible or available to me as someone from a family of 7. Something that in my mind was like a fast forward extra bonus that I was otherwise planning to have to wait for until I had my own career and money to be able to travel overseas. So all of this to say, also in my thoughts, from those big societal tick box perspectives, externally, the world was my oyster and I couldn't want for anything more. And I believe that too, that I was so lucky that I had everything. But that external situation is not the full picture. As we talked about, my internal experience was very different. I still felt like I wasn't good enough. Not that I didn't have enough, it was wholly focused on me. I wasn't good enough. In fact, my brain would spin things to say that I didn't deserve these things, and I didn't earn these things, and I wouldn't make the most of these things because there was something wrong with me. Somebody else should have these things and do better or more with them because there was something wrong with me. After rejecting Miss Harback's initial gentle concerns and prompts, she eventually used her authority to book a meeting with the school counsellor for me. The counsellor had gotten me talking on some level, and I don't remember the conversation because it didn't seem particularly significant to me. But I did keep going back, not just because I respected Miss Harback's opinion, but because on some level, this honesty, speaking in this honest way, felt quite freeing. Just being able to have the floor and speak without consequences or worrying that I'm going to say the wrong thing. But I do remember showing up one day to the appointment and my mum was there, and I remember her face. And that is when I remember the counsellor telling me, And that is when I remember the counsellor telling me that my suicidal thoughts weren't insignificant. And my mum sitting next to me, nodding with loving concern. These tears are for my past self and that obliviousness, being in a position where you can't value yourself and can't see the good things in your life, the value of your life, the value that you add to the world. Not having self-regard, thinking that you're a burden and that life is somewhat transactional. And I just know there are so many other people out there right now, adolescents and adults, who still have those beliefs. And it's just so unjust. This situation is how I can see it's meaningful for me to share my story, because without the loving concern of these amazing people in my life, without them reflecting my thoughts back to me, giving me some alternatives, telling me that something else was possible in life, that I ever had the chance to be able to think differently. So there started a journey for me for life getting better, and it was not a linear progression. I think even initially, things probably got a bit worse. I was so well practiced at judging myself. Now I thought that I was even more of the problem. There was something more wrong with me. Through my public school system, I was lucky to be sent straight to a psychiatrist that's linked up with our schools. Honestly, I didn't really get what he was saying. We didn't connect. I believe I then saw a psychologist for a while, also didn't quite connect. Then I went to my GP, who linked me up with the counsellor he had in his practice, and we connected. The way that she explained problems to me and treated me within the relationship was, as I remember, a big part of me making progress. I'm so lucky too that I had my mum who would do anything to help me. Whether she could understand her crazy teenage daughter in every situation or not, she was in full support mode. To me, these thoughts, these cognitive distortions, these thought errors were simply observations of the facts. I could not see that these were my interpretations of the facts. I thought I was just observing the facts about the insignificance of my life, my not good enoughness, and the burden that I placed on the people around me and the world. That to be here, I needed to earn my place, prove my value, justify my worth. If any of these thoughts sound vaguely convincing to you, see your doctor. Get a team around you. Don't trust your brain. So these thoughts were a very extreme example of distorted thinking. And you know, we don't actually know. To get a little bit meta and existential, philosophical, we don't know what is true for this world and our human lives. It might all be a dream. But if we know that we don't know what is true, how can my worthlessness be true? And in thought management, we ask, what results is that creating for you when you think that is true? What internal experience and what external experience are you creating? Actions and results when you decide that is true, when you think that is true. And remind us of our ability to consider what else might be true that you believe that might be more useful. So I just want to show you in this video how these thought errors, these cognitive distortions that I had, led me down this path, distortion after distortion, into a lot of the thoughts that contributed to my clinical depression. Again, just for me, in my experience, I'm not suggesting this is the case for everyone, but for me as well, as I was able to open the conversation with, negotiate with these interpretations of the world, as I was able to think differently, I got better. And it wasn't as simple as thinking differently. There was a period in which I took antidepressants, I changed some things in my lifestyle, namely my exercise, and so on. But for the purposes of this video, we're just talking about the thoughts, my thought errors. So in this catastrophic avalanching experience, my thoughts started off with things that probably a lot of us can recognize in our normal day-to-day lives. Thoughts like, I could have done better, I should have done better, I didn't get enough done today, I wasn't productive today. And as my brain offered these thoughts and believed these thoughts more and more, this flawed logic easily avalanched, amplifying and extrapolating from these distorted thoughts, from these thought errors. So this line of thinking subtly got more extravagant to things like, maybe I won't get it done, maybe I won't be able to achieve it, maybe I'm not cut out for this, maybe I can't do it, maybe I'll never be able to do this, maybe I'll never contribute anything, maybe I should just give up, maybe there's no point in trying. And really, my brain heard these questions, these possibilities, as statements. My brain, your brain, our brains are question answering machines. Your brain will always offer an opinion to a question that you ask. And subtly it was saying, I'll never be able to do this. I'll never contribute anything. I'll never be useful. I'll never have value to offer. I am a burden. I am undeserving. I am not worthy of this life. And I believed those thoughts. And it wasn't just one moment of my brain offering those thoughts and me believing those thoughts, but my brain became so efficient at thinking that way, at seeing and interpreting everything in the world that way. This was my brain's default, my brain's lens for seeing the world. So every day I found evidence to support these thoughts. And it became more and more easy for my brain to believe those thoughts. With all of this practice, they were so efficient and easily accessible to me. You can see the perfectionism programming in my thinking here. From the thoughts early on in the chain that seemed relatively harmless, but also how my brain found it logical, to more hopeless thoughts. We've talked about in one of the earlier videos how some of the core injuries of perfectionism are conflating, fusing and confusing your self-worth with your performance, your achievements, your success, what you do. And the second major injury is your definition of good enough is inadvertently perfection. You have an intolerance, there's an unacceptability to make mistakes or have any flaws. And this comes from a poorly defined definition of good enough in the first place. It's so much easier with a boundless definition of good enough. It's easier to see when we're not doing good enough by noting errors, mistakes, faults, flaws. And with that, flawless inadvertently becomes your definition of good enough, and flawless is perfection. So perfection is all that's good enough. Just refocusing on the issue of perfectionism programming here. Again, I don't want you to confuse these videos or perfectionism itself as being the same as depression. They're separate entities. So just refocusing back to perfectionism programming now. These two initial injuries are examples of cognitive distortions in themselves. When we conflate what we do with our identity. This is called labeling, the cognitive distortion labeling. When we think in absolute black and white false dichotomy terms, this cognitive distortion is called all or nothing thinking, or dichotomous thinking, another cognitive distortion. Now, these cognitive distortions set the stage for an avalanche of further cognitive distortions. And in the next video, we'll talk about that, because this is what I define as the pathology of perfectionism programming. It's also, once understood, a tangible problem, a place that we can therefore make, measure, and track progress from. This gives us some power back in the situation to see what is going on. So some other cognitive distortions that are common in the perfectionism programming are maximizing, minimizing, catastrophizing, or filtering, disqualifying the positive, overgeneralization, fortune telling, emotional reasoning, mood congruent memory bias, and the illusory truth effect. So I hope this video has been anywhere from comforting to empowering for you. Remember, perfectionism programming is not the same as mental illness, and is managed differently to mental illness. And mental illness needs to involve the input of a medical doctor. Do not attempt to diagnose or de-diagnose yourself. If there's any question at all of mental illness, I want you sitting in front of your doctor. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Thank you for joining me in this video today. Stay open and curious. Be curious with yourself in the most loving, expanding way. Give this video a like if there's anything that you found useful, so I can know what to do more of, and I'll see you guys in my next one. Bye.